You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zeno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. We always appreciate you guys being part of the show. This is a very special episode. We've interviewed a lot of people on the Hazard Ground Podcast from all different walks of life, but we are getting our first father-son duo on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Alvin Burt Grantham, A.B. Grantham as he is known, was a sergeant in the Marine Corps when he got out. He fought in the Battle of Wei, 1968 in the Tet Offensive. And his son, Joshua Grantham, was a sergeant in the Marine Corps, Recon Marine, as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom. And they join us both now on the Hazard Ground Podcast. A.B., Joshua, thank you guys so much for being here.
Hey, glad to be here.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it.
All right, well, let's start with Dad because his story is a little bit different, and obviously it's the impetus for why Joshua got into the military. But A.B., tell us how you got your start and why you enlisted and what that was like.
Well, back in the day, as we say, the draft was a big issue back when I was in high school, and my best friend, Fred Thrift, and I were in high school together, and we knew the draft was coming up, and we knew neither one of us would be going to college. So we decided that we were going to be drafted, no question about it. We decided we wanted to go, if we were going to go to war, we wanted to go with the best. So we wanted to go in the Marine Corps. And we joined on what was back then called the buddy plan so that we could be together. It didn't quite work out the way we had planned, but that was our initial motivation.
Now, you didn't know much about the war that was going on in Vietnam. Were you scared? Were you just kind of like, this is what we have to do? I mean, kind of what were your feelings? Do you remember them?
Yeah, it was kind of like something that we have to do. It was part of our civic duty. Like I said, the draft, everybody back then got drafted. So we decided that if we were going to have any control over our own destiny whatsoever, that we would just go ahead and join and do it the way we thought was the best way to do it.
And what year was that? Do you remember?
1967.
Okay, so you go right to basic, I assume, because you had no military training or anything. You go to your basic training, and take me through the timeline until you get to Vietnam.
Yes, sir. I got to Parris Island, South Carolina on 26 June 1967. Went through basic training on Parris Island and then went to infantry training right after that with a short leave in between. Went to California did what they call jungle training, and from there right on to Vietnam. And I was in Vietnam in late 1967, November of 1967.
Wow, that quick.
That's really, really fast.
Did you know what you were going to be doing in Vietnam prior to getting there?
No, sir. None of us had a clue. And when I landed at Da Nang from Okinawa, I did not know one solitary person. I was told where to go, when to go, and how to go, and you just followed orders. And I wound up with 5th Marine Regiment, 1st Battalion, Charlie Company, and was put in a machine gun team, a weapons platoon, and put in a machine gun team as an ammo humper when I first got there.
So how quickly do you get into fighting when you get there? I mean, what was the acclimation period like? Other Vietnam vets on the podcast they've really told us how hot it was there, and the weather was just unbearable at times.
Yeah, it was, but there was really no training or any acclimation time. You were put in a team, and if it was your turn to go out the wire that evening, you went. And, being a very newbie, grunt or FNG, as a lot of us call them, we were looked down on by a lot of the guys we went with, but usually you could find one or two guys that would take you under their wing and teach you the ropes. But there was no no transition time whatsoever. When you hit the ground, you were supposedly ready.
So the Tet Offensive doesn't start until 1968. You're there at the end of 1967. I mean, did you see any fighting prior to Way and the Tet Offensive?
We did. It was sporadic, usually not large firefights or engagements. It was usually ambushes. Either we got ambushed or we were setting up an ambush and got ambushed. But it was normally just small, sporadic stuff, snipers, VC, nothing concentrated like facing a big, formidable force.
Do you remember what it was like the first time you saw one of your fellow Marines go down?
Yes, it was on a ambush in December of 1967. We were setting in security on some bridges along that route, and we were trying to guard one of the bridges from being blown by the VC, and we got ambushed from behind that night. And one of the men in uh, our unit, our squad at that time had received several shrapnel injuries and needed immediate medevac that night. And we had to clear a LZ at the bottom of the hill and get him medevaced out that night.
What were your thoughts and feelings? Do you remember what it was like when you first saw that? I mean, do you remember were you in shock? Were you like, oh my God, I'm going to die here? How did you feel?
Well, I was scared to death, but I didn't feel like I was going to die. It was more of an anger thing at that time when, after a while in the bush and after getting shot at so much, you kind of lose that fear a little bit. And the fear always stays with you to some degree, but you lose it into a form of anger. It just makes you mad.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot, AB, from other Vietnam vets that they were more angry than anything. I mean, I don't know where you can draw the line between fear and anger because it seems like it's a very fine line.
Well, I guess it could be. I don't know when our anger over there was very fierce. We had anger. When we got angry, it wasn't just at who was shooting at us. It was at the whole country. It was at every person over there. It didn't matter if they were enemy or not. We were just angry for being there, angry for getting shot at, angry that our buddy got hit. We were just angry at everything and everybody.
When you say angry about being there, I've heard this sentiment from other Vietnam guys. A lot of it, the anger is that, our government put us there. Is that the way you felt?
Yeah, we felt that our government did put us there, and we were angry about it. We were angry that we weren't given the opportunity to do our job that we were sent there to do. We felt that our hands were tied by quote unquote rules of engagement and our leadership, that we didn't feel like we were being led in the right direction and we could do a lot better with a lot more than what we were allowed to be able to do.
No, that's certainly fair. So the Tet Offensive doesn't start until late January, 1968. And for those who don't know, Mark Bowden chronicled the Tet Offensive in a book that he was on the podcast. Way 1968 was the name of the book, and Way is HUE. But we discussed in detail this battle, and for those who don't know, again, it lasted almost a year, around a year, and it was some of the most heavy fighting in Vietnam, and it was a turning point in the war, as a lot of people, when they look back on it, see it. When the Tet Offensive and Way came about, what were you told prior to the mission, and what was your objective?
Well, remember, I was a PFC, so I was told where to go, when, and how to go there. So we weren't told a lot. We didn't know what was going on and what happened. We just knew that there was a lot of fighting all around us. Everybody was getting hit. There was a lot of explosions constantly everywhere. And we were just told that saddle up, we're going here and we're going there and we're going to do so and so. We weren't really given any detailed instructions or anything, and we were beefed up with extra people, which we thought were strange, that we'd been operating what we called under TO, under strength, uh, for a lot of weeks prior to this. But just before going into way, we were given extra people. And when we were given extra people, we kind of suspicion something might be up.
Yeah, something certainly was up. As it was just intense fighting. I mean, did you get the sense that this was a different battle than things you had faced before?
Oh, yes, very much. From the very beginning, when we got into Way City, and it was a city environment instead of a jungle, what we were used to fighting in the jungle. When we walked into the city and we knew that there was street fighting, we were out of our element to begin with, right off the bat. We didn't know what we were doing. We didn't know how to street fight. And we knew then that it was going to be difficult.
It's interesting you say that you didn't know anything about street fighting, because that's a huge part of what we learn now, what we call MOUT operations, urban terrain and everything else, and working in the city. Josh, just to jump in here, when you hear that they were unprepared, it seems almost crazy, because we've only fought in two environments in our lifetime, the desert and a city, correct?
Yeah. But honestly, through the training that I was lucky enough to be able to go through, it was the instructors would teach it to a point of, guys, we learned these tactics through the Battle of Way City. And so it was very unique for me of being,
okay.
My dad fought in that battle. I was told about this as a kid that is old enough and appropriate enough for that story, and growing up of, yeah, I get it. I understand it. And so honestly, our modern day tactics, Way City was our first really learning space for fighting within a city. And as you know, as well as I do, that fighting in a urban environment is what war is going to.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, AB, when you talk about not being ready and out of your element, did you feel that you were overmatched still?
Oh, yes, by far. We knew we were overmatched number wise, and we wanted bigger weapons, more firepower, and through our leaders, we were denied that because they didn't want to tear up the city, so to speak, and wouldn't give us the support, the larger guns and the more firepower that we needed to take the city back. So it was we felt hamstrung by the whole thing, because we knew we were going into an environment where the NVA was a very, very formidable force. They were not like the snipers and VC that we had been accustomed to seeing out in the bush and the jungle, where they do a lot of hit and run and fight you on their turf. These guys were dug in and standing their ground and just defying you to come and get them. And that was what we were up against.
Did that turn to like helplessness? Did you feel like you guys had no way out?
Oh, no, it really pissed us off. I mean, I dare you, stand there, buckle up, here we come. I mean, there were moments where we were, always moments where we were scared, helpless, or whatever, because it was a fierce battle. I can't even explain how fierce it was, but it was very, very high powered, day and night sometimes. And so we were determined. We had a job to do. We were sent to do this job, and we were determined we were going to see it through. I went in with Charlie 1, 1-5, 1st Platoon. The first day we went in, we had 53 Marines we went in the Citadel with. And at the end of the day, we were left with 28.
Oh, wow.
So that's the kind of buzzsaw we walked into.
Is there
And
any particular instance that stands out to you that you saw?
oh, there was a lot of bloodshed. There were Marines down in the street in front of us that we couldn't get to. We didn't dare risk sending people after them unless we were absolutely sure that they were dead. So sometimes they would lay out there until dark, and we could go out under cover to retrieve some of the bodies. But yeah, it was so fierce that we had a difficult time retrieving wounded off the field.
Well, I assume if that was the case, almost trying to get a wounded guy was feels like a death sentence for the person who had to do that.
It was, it could have been, and it was in some cases, but you don't leave a wounded man exposed. That's just not done. And if it was you or I, we would hope that somebody would have the guts enough to come out there and help us and save us and bring us back. And that's what we did because that was our brothers laying out there. It wasn't some stranger or some enemy. That was our brothers that was helping keep me alive, and we're going after it.
Do you remember a time where you had to go get somebody and how much fear was involved in that, or were you able to block that out, or what?
Well, yeah, more than once. And it's, it's difficult to explain. And you're kind of operating on an automatic at that time. Not only are you mad, you're pissed off, and you're really, really angry about what's going on, but you really want to recover what you have lost, and that's your brothers. And there were cases where we had to go out and get people to drag them to safety when you just figured, well, I may get hit too, but I'm going out. And it's just something we did.
You got wounded there in Way. Can you tell us about what happened to you?
Yeah, as I said, I was in a machine gun crew. And machine guns are very formidable. They're have a lot of firepower. M60 was the crew I was in. And that morning, early, right when it broke daylight, the NVA, which was right across the street, maybe 50 feet at the most, they hit us with everything they had that morning, very hard. And the first round they fired was a rocket round right into the room of the house that I was in. And the intention was to knock out the machine gun and the firepower, and then they could advance across the street to where we were. And that's tactics. That's just standard military tactics. And they were good at it. They did a very good job. We got hit very, very hard that morning, and fighting was hand to hand. They were in the middle of us, and they had given orders to fix bayonets, and there was that many all around. And everybody in my machine gun crew got wounded from that rocket round except for me. And I grabbed, after dragging the wounded out the back of the house, I grabbed the machine gun, and they were calling for the machine gun on the corner. They were getting overrun on the corner of the street intersection, and I grabbed the machine gun and ran down to the corner. And I see lots of NVA enemy troops all around the house that supposedly had Marines in it. And the NVA was all around the house with a rifle shooting in the window, on the front porch, aiming the weapons at me. And I jump in another house next door to it and go to the window and start unloading the machine gun in that direction. And after a couple of minutes, somebody hollered at me and said, "Quit shooting, cease fire. There's Marines in that house." And I said, "Well, there may be Marines in that house, but there's NVA all around the outside of it. If there's Marines in there, they're either incapacitated or dead." So it was that kind of environment that morning. And that went on for a little while, where it was very intense gun battle. between NVA and us, and that's when I got a round in the center of the chest, an AK-47 round. It hit me right dead center of the chest and exited out my back below my right shoulder blade.
Wow. Okay, a lot to process here.
Yeah.
When you got hit, I mean, obviously you knew immediately you were hit, but what were you thinking and feeling?
Well, when I got hit, it knocked me quite a few feet backwards because it hit right in the center of my chest on the bone. And it knocked me several feet, and I landed flat on my back. And I knew I was hit very, very bad at that time. And my initial thought was that I'm not going to make it out of this one. This one is bad. And I just hollered that I'm hit, and a couple of Marines came up and started initiating first aid, helping me with my wound. But I knew that from the telltale signs of my body, I didn't believe I was going to make it at that time.
Did you look down at the wound and just go into shock, or what?
No, I didn't. I didn't look at the wound at all. I knew it was bad, and I was having trouble breathing. It was what they call a sucking chest wound. When I tried to inhale, air would spurt out of the holes, out of my chest and out of my back. And when I tried to inhale, it would suck air in the holes and through my mouth. And that way I wasn't using my lung to breathe, only the air sucking in and out of the holes of my wound. And I knew I lost a lot of blood, and some of the guys that were with me took a bunch of what the doctor called was Lucky Strike cigarette packs and stuffed it in the holes to stop the air from coming in and out, to keep me to breathing, and turned me on my right side so my left lung wouldn't fill up with blood, because my right lung was completely collapsed and shot through. And so that's kind of how we stayed for a little while until they could evacuate me out.
All right, the evacuating you out part, believe it or not, folks, it actually gets even worse. We'll get to that in a minute. But Josh, I want to bring you in here. When was the first time you heard that story?
To the detail that I know that story, the first time was not until I came back from boot camp after I became a Marine. I had always known about the story and the picture. My father's a very humble man and never really talked about his Vietnam service growing up. Again, he came back, and society was a lot different than the wars that I came back to and that you came back to. And so it was, don't talk about it for him. And so that bled over to the family, although internally we knew. And it's funny. He's my hero. He's who I look up to. Pretty big shoes to fill. And I find myself learning more every day. I learned more once I finally earned the title of United States Marine. I learned more after my first combat tour. I learned even some more after my second combat tour that I hadn't known. And sometimes to this day, I still learn new things that he's just not been willing to share. And I don't blame him. Because some of that stuff is between you and your maker. You know what I'm saying?
No, absolutely. It's certainly, and you and I both, can have the empathy for that as we've been through a war, and there are certain things you'll only share with God. And AB, I respect that opinion. I thank you for sharing the story with us. You mentioned a picture, and I just want to give people a visual. There's a famous picture taken by a photographer named John Olson, who was an award-winning photographer. And this was from the Battle of Way, and it's 7 Marines on top of a tank being transported, and you can see several of them are wounded. One has a bandage wrapping around his entire head, another one has blood coming out of his leg, and there is a Marine laying on top of a door that is shirtless with a bandage around his chest and looks unconscious, if not dead, in the picture. And that Marine happens to be A.B. Grantham. And when the photo was released, for those listening, no names were put on it or anything. It was just a photo. And it was an award-winning photo, and it kind of encapsulated the Battle of Way and everything that went into it. And it wasn't until years later, and A.B., I'll allow you to tell the story, when you finally realized that you were in that photo. But Joshua, again, when you hear your dad tell these stories, what's your emotional feeling like?
Oh, man. First of all, I want to say is he doesn't look any better today than he did there. He's still an ugly old man.
You don't have to take that from him, AB. You don't have to take that from him.
That's one.
Well, and here's the cool part, and this is kind of part of what you talked about in the podcast of not only we father and son, but we're also brothers and best friends, and he's my hero. So it's a very unique thing. But to get back to your question of what do I think about that, it's not really a lot of words can say that. I'm in awe. It's the best thing that I can give you is I revert back to what the Marines taught us and it's to uphold that honor and that courage and the commitment that those guys had. Not only my father, but for my father's best friend that died over there, and all of the service members, not just the Marines. It's a tremendous reputation that we have strived, and all the guys that I served with tried to strive to uphold.
What I think about when I hear stories from Vietnam vets, and much like similar to yours, AB, is I think, holy bleep, thank God I don't have to fight under those conditions. Like I never had. I at least I remember going outside the wire. I had body armor. Like I had, more protective equipment now than those guys ever had. And AB, a lot of Vietnam vets just say, well, we didn't know that we weren't going to have armor. Like if we had known, we would love to have had it. We never had it back then. And I'm just amazed that fighting a battle like that in general would literally scare the piss out of me. Like it just would, because I would feel naked not going out without my Kevlar and my body armor, right? I mean, when did we ever leave the wire, Joshua, without full kit on?
Well, my story might be a little bit different, depending on the mission that I did. But
yes.
I actually, the old man won't admit it, but he actually had his body armor on, and one of the interesting things too is the evolution of the body armor. He had the old school flak jacket zip up with the 4-panel plates that were inserted, and they hit him right in the zipper. Well, there was no coverage there.
Oh, you got to be
kidding me. Now, when I left the wire, I had my plates on, but it had that same thing that you had that you inserted that covered the vital organs on the front and the back.
Got it. Yeah. Wow. Crazy. All right, AB, let's get back to this here for a minute. So they have stopped or slowed the bleeding. You're back to breathing somewhat. Tell us when you finally get evac'd out of the area. And again, that picture, you guys rolled out on a tank. You were laying on a door. But what do you remember what happened next?
Well, I remember it was a very, very rough ride. Tanks have no shock absorbers at all. I tell you that now. And when you're busted up in the ribs and in the chest, it hurts like hell. But I remember the ride very, very vividly, and was trying to stay conscious as much as possible, but it was in and out. And I remember back at one of the aid stations just before they took me to Fubai, where they had a MASH unit. They had to actually put me in a body bag because we had so many people wounded at that time. There were so many down that the corpsmen were just overwhelmed and they couldn't get to everybody. So they were helping out who they could and trying to save as many as they could with the means that they had. If they didn't figure that you were going to make it anyway, they just kind of put you aside and help somebody else that would make it. And I was put in a body bag, and I remember laying there, and I heard one of the corpsmen say that this one's not dead yet. Well, I didn't know he was talking about me at the time, but I remember thinking that poor son of a bitch must be hit bad if he said he's not dead yet.
Can we say that? Can we say that on the podcast?
Yeah, you're fine. Folks,
sorry.
listen, just think about this visual here for a second. I'm sorry. So you were alive and they tried to zip you in a body bag for a dead person.
That's correct. That's correct. And that wasn't uncommon then, to be honest with you. If somebody was hit bad enough to where the corpsmen knew they couldn't save them, they'd just put them aside and let them go because we had more people that needed help. And as bad as that sounds, when you're in war, in a situation that we were in, everybody did the best they could. And, that's just a fact of war, fact of life. But I don't remember much after that, other than I remember being put on the chopper and being choppered to Fubai, to the MASH unit, and was rolled inside the MASH unit, and there were just row after row of operating lights hanging from the ceiling, and it seemed like hundreds of people in there to me, but it was very loud, lots of screaming, lots of hollering, lots of people running around, and they threw me on a table, stripped all my clothes off of me, started giving me shots, and the doctor started cutting my chest open even before I was out. And that hurt very bad. And that's the last I remember.
Did you at any point recognize that or I should say, when you recognized that you were the one in the body bag that he was talking about, like, what were you thinking? What goes through your mind?
Well, I didn't at the time even really recognize it. I was just thinking, I need some help here. And, but they got somebody else that sounds like that needs help worse than I do, because he said this one's not dead yet. And I guess I just didn't realize at the time that the severity of the situation that I was in. And by that time, I'd lost so much blood and was in and out of consciousness so much that I don't remember a whole lot.
So there was no my whole life flashed before my eyes kind of deal?
Oh, yeah, there was a lot of that. I did have a lot of time. And as I told somebody just this past week, I was interviewing with a producer that's doing a documentary, that it actually became peaceful after a little while, where your mind goes to a place that is actually peaceful. And I remembered way back when I was 5 years old and 10 years old, and all of the family stuff, and you think about your mother and your loved ones and all back home, and you just knew you weren't going to be able to see them again, so you just enjoyed them in your mind at that point. So it becomes a peaceful time at that point.
Okay, so when you get evac'd out there and you start your recovery process, that obviously ends your time in Vietnam and you don't go back, correct?
Oh, that's correct, yeah.
Okay.
I spent altogether about 12 months in and out of the hospital, mostly in, a little over 12 months, really, mostly in the hospital with several other conditions other than the gunshot. But I weighed 165 pounds when I got shot. When I got back, I weighed 119 pounds. I lost 46 pounds in less than 2 months.
Wow.
And I didn't have any fat on me to lose at that point. So if I hadn't have been in such great physical condition, if the Marines hadn't had me in the physical shape that I was in, I would not have made it. No way.
Man, I'm just trying to, I can't even, Josh, when you hear the whole thing in its entirety, and obviously he's your dad, but do you stand there and look and go, I don't ever know how he became my dad, because how is he still here?
It's hard to think about that. Um, Part of that stuff is why he's my hero. That he had the physical and spiritual and mental fortitude to fight through that and to stay alive so I could be here. And he's my hero. That's a little bit what drove me to become a Marine. And when I say a little bit, I mean a lot.
So let's kind of shift here. You know, picking up on that same point. Growing up as a kid, your dad never talked about Vietnam or the Marine service, or did he?
Very little. It was known that my dad was a Marine. Yeah. At the age of 5 years old, I was put to bed as a position of attention. And it was after my mother tucked me in was sweet. My dad would sit at the lights and go, "Ready, sleep," and turn the lights out.
Okay.
Yeah. And funny enough, I do this to my child now, my 5-year-old, and I would be woken up with, "Wake up, ladies, get your war gear on." As a kid, like elementary school, so I never knew what that meant. It was just Dad's waking me up, and that was really most of the reference. Other than that, he never really talked about it until I got a little bit older, and even then, it was just, "Yeah, I was there. That's my picture. I don't want to talk about it."
So you asked questions, but you were kind of denied.
Yeah, and it made sense because there's no way I could understand it at that time.
AB, why were you so hesitant to tell him anything about the Marines? Like even just about what being a Marine was like, or anything else. Forget the war stories of Vietnam. Were you? I mean, everything in general. You were hesitant to talk to him about?
Well, yeah, at first, if he was going to go in the military, I wanted him to go in the Air Force, definitely not the Marine Corps. But back then, during that day and time, when I came back, it wasn't cool to be a Vietnam veteran. As a matter of fact, it was a detriment to you as you looked on from a public standpoint. So many of us Vietnam veterans hid the fact that we were Vietnam veterans because it would give people a preconceived notion of who you were before you even had a chance to prove yourself, insofar as getting jobs or meeting people or anything at all. There was a very, very bad climate in the country at that time, and a bad feeling toward the war and the Vietnam veterans. So when we came back, we didn't come back as a unit. We came back one by one whenever our rotation was up or we got hit and got out of the hospital. So we were alone, and we were thrust back into the civilian world, and we were expected to fit in, which we didn't, but we had to adjust our behavior and our mind frame in order to fit in. So we tried to be like everybody else and hide the fact that you were a Vietnam veteran, because you didn't want them to have bad feelings about you, especially on job interviews and things like that. So it was something that we kind of did for a long time, and it became second nature. We buried the war way back in our soul and our mind somewhere and didn't talk about it.
Did that make you more inquisitive, Joshua?
To a degree, yes. Because I had seen the picture and kind of wanted to know, like, how did you go from that to where you are? Because my father's a very humble man and he won't talk about himself, but the things that he has done since his service should be as commended as what he did. He's the only person that I know that has a master's degree and an executive MBA that does not have a high school diploma nor a undergraduate diploma,
Wow.
but he has an MBA. You figure that out.
No, I can't.
I'm still trying to figure that out. It was back in the day before the digital stuff, and he just kept blending in and doing it. He became a good chameleon.
All right. Well, I love the connective tissue between the whole thing. I want to get back to that more, but Joshua, I do want to hear about your experience. So you enlisted in the Marine Corps. What was the conversation with your dad like when you said, "Hey, I want to go be a Marine"?
It wasn't really a conversation. It was a surprise. This is what I did.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because that wasn't going to be allowed. My father served in Vietnam and did his story, and he thought that he had did enough. And his uncle died on the beaches of Normandy. My grandfather worked in the shipyards in Mobile. His brother was in the Navy during Korea. He was like, look, the Grantham family's done enough. I did all this so you don't have to.
Right. So, AB, when he comes home and says surprise, what's your reaction?
Really shock and dismay. I was afraid for him, and I did not want him joining the Marine Corps for the reasons of all of the stuff that I went through, and knowing that he may have to go through the same thing. But I was really kind of upset.
Well, were you more upset because it was at a time of war and we were already into this thing? I mean, had it been at peacetime, would you have had less reservations about it, AB?
Well, probably that had a lot to do with it, time of the war. But I really, as far as I would rather had him go into the Air Force or some other branch that he could learn more of a trade than killing people. Marine Corps, I mean, let's face it, be honest. I mean, that's what the Marine Corps does. That's what we're for. That's what we're trained to do. And that's not what I wanted for my child.
Well, what's done is done, Joshua. You enlisted in the Marine Corps. You head off to boot camp. Give me your timeline before you get to your first deployment.
All right. So I do the little backstory. I'm a sophomore in college when the 9/11 attack occurs. And I've woken up and watched this. I watch it on live TV, and I've been thinking about it because at this point in college, I was majoring in chasing tail and drinking booze, right? Wasn't really concentrating on something. And then I always have this tug at my family core. This is what my family does. We step up when the nation needs us. One thing that my father did not tell you is that he dropped out of high school to join the Marine Corps in 1967. He did not wait to be drafted. It's kind of a interesting point on that story, and so I felt the duty. Finished that semester up. Said, "All right, I'm doing it. I'm joining," and I joined. And so I joined January after 9/11, and did boot camp. Got back. I originally was going to sign a reserve contract. I thought it was going to be slick, and I joined 3rd Force Reconnaissance Company, and on a pipeline contract where I have to do boot camp, infantry school, and then also recon school, and a bunch of other schools that I had to do. So out of my entire time, I served from January of 2002 to October of 2008. I spent less than 9 months on actual reserve status. The rest of it was active duty.
Okay, so how quickly do you end up in a deployment?
I got notice in October of 2003 that, yeah, we're about to go replace the initial push. We knew we were going to be coming out of there very soon. And so we started our workups in October, and then we deployed. I was boots on ground February the 1st of 2004 with the 7th Marine Corps Regiment. We took over the 3rd Infantry Division's, the 3rd ID's spot in Al Assad.
Okay. So, AB, when Joshua calls you and tells you that he's going to deploy, what was your feelings and reaction?
That's one of the most emotional, worst moments of your life, is to hear that your child is going to war. I can only think of one worse at this point, and I lost a son to an accident, a plane crash back in 2010. And I can't think of anything worse in this world than losing a child. And I guess the next would be to hear that you have a child going to a battle zone. And, you try to keep a good faith, you try to keep a good attitude about it. But in reality, it's very, very, very difficult. And while he was over there, we'd talked to him some, on the sat phone from time to time, and we knew he was just outside of Fallujah. And at the time, Fallujah was a very hot spot. And the news had came on the TV and said that Marines are moving into Fallujah, and they haven't seen battle like this since the Battle of Way City in Vietnam. And that'll get your attention because, as you know, that's where I was. So I knew what he was heading into, and that really stirs you up pretty bad.
Were you more forthcoming with, stories and advice and everything that you went through, AB, when you found out he was going to deploy, to try to help, kind of guide him through and give him some tips or anything like that?
Well, yes, to some degree, yes. When we talked, it was more on a brother Marine basis at that point in time because it was about survival. It wasn't, I couldn't protect him anymore. So I felt that it was my responsibility or my job to help him make it through whatever he was fixing to go through.
Joshua, were you happy that he opened up to you more?
I don't know if happy would be the word. It is. He was already my hero and my father, and since I had earned the title of United States Marine, we became brothers. But it just made it that much closer. But hearing his stories definitely helped because we knew we were going into Iraq and doing city fighting at that time for the OIF 2. And like I told you earlier, we learned off of his experience of how to fight in the street. And so that was where some of our tactics and procedures were developed from, and we improved on. I don't know. It just created this weird, great, tight bond that my mother jokes and says that we have a mutual worship society. It's weird.
Okay, so what were you told during your first deployment that you were doing?
Our basic thing, I was with 3rd Force Reconnaissance Company. We got attached to 1st Force Reconnaissance Company. And our job was to do a couple different things. We were there to do counterinsurgency and counter IED stuff. So basically, in the area of operation, we would set up hide sites and do watchovers, so that people couldn't put in IEDs over highly valuable MSRs or military supply routes. Sorry. Um, and then we would also do raids where we would go from intel that we would get. We would go do a SWAT team like raid on a location to capture high value individuals.
And so when you get into your first kind of round of fighting, after you get back and everything else, and you kind of take a moment to breathe, did you want to talk to your dad about it? Did you feel that, hey, I want to let him know what's going on kind of deal?
Oh, yes. I was like, hey, I did this. And because I finally knew that after I had been to combat and earned my combat action ribbon, he would finally open up and tell me the stories.
Really? So kind of that was, I don't want to say motivation for you, but knowing that you had that kind of, was your badge of honor, so to speak.
No, it's not a badge of honor. It was more of I can finally get another piece of the story, and they were so happy to have me back, and just that we could talk on an even deeper level at another point, of, all right, now I understand what it's like being shot at or having mortar shot at you.
And so, AB, did you have the same feeling now that he had, gotten that badge and he was back? I mean, did you feel like you could open up to him more?
I felt like he would understand more about what I was talking about and what we went through. I felt like he would be able to absorb more of the story at that time. Yes.
And so, what were some of the things that you were more willing to tell him, so to speak?
Well, the day-to-day stuff that civilians, as you know, will never understand what it's like to be in combat and to be in situations. And there's no way, shape, or form that you can explain it to anybody. So, any of the day-to-day operations that we went through and some of the stuff that we saw and some of the things that we did in particular were more accessible stories that I could share with him, whereas he wouldn't be able to absorb or even understand before he went through combat.
So, Josh, you kind of have this new bond and this new kind of relationship with all this extra information. Did that kind of, I guess, give you a little more want to stay in the Marine Corps longer, or did you feel like maybe you did what you needed to do and you can get out? Because you stayed in, I think, for a total of 6 years?
Around about 6 years, little over. But after going through that and having Pops as my father, again, I joined a reserve contract, and in the reserve contract, once you get called up on presidential orders, you're relieved of any obligation.
Right.
And so we got back. Everybody's happy, doing good. But we know this ain't going away. And so that was one of the hardest things I had to tell my parents was that I got to go again, and I don't have to. I'm not contractually obligated. But at that time, and it's the difference between what my father went through and what I went through. When he went out, they went out as individual people. They did not deploy as a group. As he said earlier, he deployed out there as a individual. They got thrown into a group. Hey, here's your people. Here's your gun. Go get them. The difference in some of the learning process that the Marine Corps and the United States military learned as a whole was that doesn't create really great unit cohesion. And so with us, the group of guys that I deployed with, we had been together for a couple of years, about a year before deployment, through deployment, and getting ready to go to another deployment. And so, although I did not legally have to go, I could not look my dad in the face and go, "Yeah, I'm gonna stay home because you don't want me to go, and I'm gonna let those guys go and risk their lives."
AB, were you okay with that decision, or did you try to talk him out of it?
No, I was okay with it. I understood at that time. Once once you have that experience, then I felt better about his second deployment than I did his first.
Really?
Yes, I did. I felt more confident in his ability and the people he was with and the people that was leading him and where he was going to be. And I felt even more confident on his second deployment than I did his first.
Did you feel more confident on your second deployment, Josh?
Yes, I did. At that time, I thought I was 10 foot tall and bulletproof.
And unfortunately, you found out you're not.
Oh yeah, I found out real quick, fast, in a hurry. But you know, our core group of guys within our platoon were the same people. We had the same platoon sergeant and the same platoon commander. And at that time, with what we were doing, we were pretty good at what we did.
I had watched them train for a long time and had been with them on some training issues and stuff, and was intimately involved with a lot of the people that he was with as a unit, and his leaders, his sergeants, platoon sergeants, captains, lieutenants, all the way up. And their training and regiment and their cohesiveness as a unit is what gave me the confidence that I had whenever he was going back. I knew that they were as prepared as anybody could ever be for what they were going into.
So, Josh, your first deployment, you come out unscathed, relatively obviously, but not the case on your second deployment. What happened?
The short story was I missed a hole. Basically, we were raiding a house. What we did, we would, like I said earlier, we were like a SWAT team. We would go in and go do raids on high value targets. And getting from our intel, and without getting into the stuff that I can't talk about or shouldn't talk about, but it was, go get the bad guy, go raid that house. And we went into one scenario, and I missed a big hole. It was a 4-foot hole, and I fell into it and blew my ankle out. Yeah, it compared to my old man story, I'm like, yeah, I should have just jumped up and kept going into the fight, but I couldn't walk. But it's it is what it is. I continued on with the mission. We still successfully completed what we needed to do in raiding that area, and I got the intel that we needed to get. I had to do some rehab, and I got back into the fight a couple of months later.
Did you feel like, I mean, the way I phrase this question sounds silly in my head, so forgive me if it comes out that way, but did you feel like you didn't live up to what your dad went through because of what happened to you versus what happened to him? Was there any of that going on in your mind?
Oh, it still does to this day.
Now, why does that bother you?
Like I said earlier, I have a tremendous reputation to uphold. Whether that reputation wasn't to go be a bullet catcher,
Right?
but I don't know. I hold him in high regard. But on the other hand, I did exactly what my job was to the best degree that I could. And we also had a lot different jobs. When he was in Vietnam, he was a machine gunner in a different war. I was a recon Marine in a different war. So his job was to seek out, close with, and destroy the enemy with fire and maneuver. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas my job was a little bit different.
Sure.
I was our company, our platoon, my team was to be the forward eyes and ears of the commander. And the recon job is a lot different than the infantry job.
Absolutely.
Even though it's still a infantry position, we're supposed to run from fight. We're traditionally
right.
We're supposed to be there to gather intel. Now, on some things, we would bring the fight. I can think of, in 2006, we would do some missions where we would load up on some birds and basically go look for a fight. Travel to MSRs and just be there as a show of force. And if something popped up, well, guess what? You got a recon team there that can go do stuff. And we were able to do some really good work. As far as, we saved some hostages that were about to get killed and got the bad guys, all the tied up with apple pie. So I don't hammer myself at all in thinking, and we don't do the competition of he served better than I did or I served better than he did. We were both there to do our jobs, and it was a much different job. Although we do talk about that, although Vietnam and Iraq or Afghanistan, the war on terror generally, are two different wars, there's also a lot of comparisons that it's the same war, but in a different climate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, AB, when you hear your son say that he has a lot to live up to, when you look at what he's done and completed, I mean, I'm sure you feel like he's already lived up to it and more.
Oh, exactly. And, I didn't do anything especially great. Yeah, I was on a picture, but that picture is a point in time, just a second. It's a flash of what the Battle of Way was. I just happened to be there at that time. So did the rest of the guys on the tank. We weren't chosen. We weren't heroes. We weren't anything else. We were just in a picture that happened to become popular. Not unlike the guys raising the flag on Iwo Jima. They were in the picture and they just happened to be there in the picture at that time. And I don't compare the two pictures. Don't get me wrong, because the guys on Iwo Jima are irreverent to me. But it is a picture in time, and it's the whole story about what the Marine Corps is and does throughout the years is documented, and it's, everybody knows about who the Marine Corps is and what they do. And so I didn't do anything any more than anybody else. To me, the Marines today are much better than we were. They're more highly trained and more physically fit. They have more high technology weapons. They have more equipment, better equipment. They're so much better than we were back then. But
I keep telling him that, Mark, but he keeps still calling me a boot.
But we were what we were, and we were the best America had at the time. And we did what we could, and we did our best. And that's all you can ask of anybody. And that's what the Marines do today. And so, we were no more of a hero than any of the other Marines before us. It's the ones that didn't make it back was the heroes. But, Marines today are very, very, very good. Very good.
Understatement.
And
I would like to ask you. I mentioned the picture before, and I described the picture earlier. And again, you didn't know you were in it, and I wanted you to tell that story because I think it's very poignant. How did you find out that you were in that picture, and who told you?
I was in the hospital at the time, and I had a brother-in-law that lived in Fort Walton Beach, Florida, and he was getting a haircut in a barber shop and picked up a magazine and was reading a magazine before he was called to the barber's chair. And he looked in the magazine and saw that picture and instantly recognized me and brought it to the hospital in Pensacola, Florida, where I was. And he said, "Look, I believe this is you." And I looked at the picture and I said, "Well, yeah, that is me." And my mother had, of course, found out about it as well. And she wrote Life magazine at the time. And Life magazine sent her several copies of the photo in folders and stuff. And I still have one or maybe two of the originals that they sent out. And it's been publicized in a lot of magazines and publications since then. But it was just serendipity that my brother-in-law happened. I probably would have ran up on it again later or something, but it was a brother-in-law of mine that initially saw it and brought it to our attention.
So when you saw it, did you look at it and remember anything? Do you remember laying on the door and everything else, or did that?
I remembered every minute of that
Okay.
because that was painful. That was a painful ride. It was not a Lincoln I was riding on. It was a tank. It did not have any shocks.
And that's just when you see the picture, Josh, and you know when you and your dad talk about the picture, kind of what do you feel about it?
Kind of like what my old man said is that, you know, it's a legacy we got to uphold. And as Marines and as brothers, like he said, it's he was trying to just do the best he could to uphold and defend the United States of America and the Marine Corps' honor from the legacy that was left from him from Iwo Jima and World War II. And that's kind of the same mindset I carried into Iraq.
So where are you guys now with all this? Obviously, Josh, your military career is over. You've gone on to bigger and better things. You're a lawyer now, and I assume maybe you're happily enjoying retirement. But when you guys get together over a beer or whatever, do you end up retelling a lot of these stories to each other?
Well, Mark, if I could, I would like to take this. What has been the best therapy for both of us? Not only is sitting down and talking to each other because we have similar experiences, although they're different, but it's getting involved in helping out other veterans. Me and my father are both lifelong life members now of the Marine Corps League. He is actually the Department of Alabama Commandant, which means he's basically the head honcho in charge of the state of Alabama Marine Corps League. I am also a lifelong member of the Marine Corps League. I also am the general counsel of the Recon Sniper Foundation. And all of these organizations seek out to help Marines, corpsmen, chaplains, but also other veterans. And that's what I see is what has helped both me and my father of dealing with some of the issues that we may have is, guess what? Because this is just two stories, as you know, in your podcast, and the point of it is getting the stories out there of the stories that you don't hear, and so getting involved is you can learn something from getting involved with other veterans and being a part of their lives.
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, that's part of what this podcast is all about. But in general, it's just there's so much to the after military experience that people don't get. And this question, I want to start with AB because I think it's poignant. You guys touched on it, and we talk about it so much with Vietnam vets. You know, Vietnam vets, when they got home, they were spat upon. Like, they were treated like they were second-class citizens, and they weren't even good enough to call themselves American, which, when I think back on it, just angers me because it's so disgusting. AB, when you look back on that and you see the way your son was treated when he got back and people like me were treated, what's your reaction?
Well, our reaction was great elation. It was a huge relief because we, as Vietnam veterans, wanted to make sure that that never happened again to any of our troops or any of our warriors that go to war and come back. And we did not want them to be in the same situation or be treated the same way that we were treated. We wanted to give them their due and their hero's welcome that they deserved, and so it was super elation for us. And I guarantee you, we were on the front row waving the flags and welcoming them home and cheering them uh, for all we could because that's what they needed.
Did you ever feel like, why didn't we get this? I mean, that's a fair thought. If you ask me, that is a absolutely fair thought. That, you know, where were you guys before, so to speak?
It is, but at that time, it's water under the bridge. It's in the past, and let's move on. And most of us had already dealt with it. We've been dealing with it for years. Some of us are still dealing with it today. I told a guy yesterday morning, I've been in therapy for 29 years, and I plan to stay because I need it, not because I want it, because I need it. And that's just the way it is. And to see that these guys are, and many of them are going to need therapy and still have some of the same problems we have, PTSD and some of the same emotional problems of war that we as Vietnam veterans had as well. But it helps when the country is behind you and the civilian population is behind you and they support you and you have the support of everybody else around you. It really helps a lot.
So, Josh, when you think back to the way your father and his fellow Marines and soldiers were treated when they got back, what's your response given how much guys like you and me have been patted on the back and given thank yous all over the place?
They were not treated properly. Again, it's war and politics, unfortunately, get very close because war is basically an extension of politics that is a failed negotiation, if you look at it by definition. And I'm very pleased now that my father and his generation are finally getting their due. Again, they were drafted. They didn't sign up for that. They were told to go do it, which is a little bit different from my generation and yours as well. We're all volunteers. We try to do this because we have a sense of duty, and maybe we have a parent or a close family relative that was drafted, and so they have that connection. So I will have to agree with my father. Again, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree in that, you know what, just happy that they're finally getting it. And I'm not going to get into the politics of 69 because I wasn't even a twinkle in an eye, by the way.
Hey, Mark, one thing I wanted to interject. I had an interview a few weeks back and was fortunate to be a part of a discussion with Congressman Trent Kelly from Mississippi, and he asked, talking about the Battle of Way, how could you guys stay motivated knowing that the next morning you get up, that it's going to be the same thing and you're going to have to slug it out, and it's a gun battle and it's fighting for your life and you're going to lose people and you're going to, how did you stay motivated day after day after day to keep getting up to do that kind of thing? And I told him, well, we didn't want to go to jail because it was either that or jail because we were drafted, or,
Right.
In Marine Corps, we weren't drafted, but we would have been. But that was our motivation back then, was to stay alive and stay out of jail. So
different times, obviously. I mean, just it's unreal to hear you guys talk. And listen, I think you're both incredibly blessed and lucky, and obviously, AB, lucky to be alive. But you've gotten to this point, and to see your son go be a Marine and go serve his country and come back home to you and your family has just got to be one of the most rewarding things in the world for you. And I love the synergy between you two, and I'm floored and so happy for you both. I mean, I don't know how else to phrase it any other way, but it's incredible. And hearing both of your stories side by side, we could talk for hours and days even about all this stuff, but it's just incredible to see a father and son have that connection, because it doesn't happen often.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it. Thank a vet and pass it forward, and I appreciate it very much.
And Josh, same to you, brother.
And Mark, what I like to say, and also to all the listeners that are out there that will listen or are currently listening to this podcast, is don't let your service define who you are. There's a whole life in front of you. Go out there and continue to uphold the values that you upheld while you were serving. And if you get into hard times, reach out to someone. The reason I'm here in Mobile is because I was here to do a veterans hike to raise awareness for veteran suicide. Although we're getting a hurricane and it got canceled, we're still going to have a hurricane party. Originally, our podcast, we were supposed to do it earlier, but Mark, as I said, that you are you're a battalion commander, and you got called up. That's why we had to get delayed. So you understand that. But I think that is one of the biggest things, is don't let your time in service define who you are. That is just a chapter in your life. You have to take those same principles, the same guiding values, and drive forward and keep doing on and keep upholding those values. And there are tons of organizations, and I'm sure, Mark, that you can let everybody listening know, but I'm going to do the gratuitous call out that we have the Marine Corps League that me and both my father are part of, and anybody of any service can join, and we'd love to have you. And also the Recon and Sniper Foundation, we're nationwide as well as the Marine Corps League, but the Recon and Sniper Foundation is also out there. If you need help, we're the eyes and ears of the veteran community.
A.B. Grantham, Joshua Grantham, thank you so much for your time, your service, and sacrifice to our country and dedication. We sincerely appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, sir.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.